I'm thinking about the theory of Rasas that were mentioned in this discourse, in this immersion, and the last one. And you went into further detail in this immersion. And I was wondering, how do our knowledge of the rasas, how does that help us? How does that make us live a fuller life?
Well, the simple answer to that is, I think it was already communicated, that it simply brings the integrity through understanding. And therefore, it felt to me the most fitting example, to which I keep going back to, is the colors of the spectrum. We may have preference for certain colors, and we should, right? We should have preference for, let's say, the rasa of love, the amorous one. It's very natural. I think it's also a very subtle one, but just as to continue with, before going into the why that is. Understanding that our preferences may be for this or that emotional state of what each and every rasa represents. It is in totality of the presence of all the rasas that gives the sense of fullness to human experience, which is immediately, as we say that, requires an adjustment. What do we mean by human experience? Because human experience here only spoken in terms of divine manifestation. So the rasas is a confirmation of that, where the full circle comes into a closure and that final touching takes place, of which so much again and from the perspective of Shaivite Tantras, it is through the experience of the senses, the objects of experience, for which this whole orchestration here is being put forth in the first place. And it is due to the fact that these rasas, that they represent the totality, this totality of the fullness of human experience here, is not on the account of how this perhaps understood in terms of the currently shared consensus, which has beneath that a greatly psychologized outlook and understanding on emotional states, but how emotional states themselves are manifestations of a particular quality of awareness. Those Shaktis, those deities that are truly represented through emotional states. Therefore, each emotional state, just as the color of the spectrum that presents itself, let's say, as indigo, mauve, red, and then it goes to, like, let's say, coral, right? That vermilion, orange, to yellow, to that lime. And as it progressively, there are three distinctive ones out of which everything is made, right? This is also very, very tantric, as well as very physical in terms of physics, as well as optical, right? Goethe spoke about and wrote endlessly about the theory of colors in relation to the optics, in terms of the superimposition of the colors and what have you. And Leonardo da Vinci did that as well. So, but here in tantric sense, the birthing, let's say, of green as a result of the superimposition of fusion, merging of the primary blue and primary yellow, right? Here represents also a gradational tonalities and hues which in themselves are manifestation of further gradations of these deities that keep projecting themselves. So the emotional states here also defined into distinctive 8 with an additional shanta added by Abhinavagupta as that what illumines them and that what also culminating state where all these emotions or each of these emotions, whenever experienced fully, awareness falls back to, because that's what awareness here is represented through that. So emotional states here is a fascinating part of the Tantras, because this emotional states is not, in fact, where we are scattered around, fragmented into our human experience. But actually, that's where the human experience, tangibly a conformation of divine affair. So when given that gloss, when given that angle of understanding, then experiencing of each and every of the emotional states is always a possibility for tapping into that what each particular emotional state, each particular rasa represents. Again, just as in terms of colors, for the musician, because musicians also work in terms of colors, right? I remember, just as a side note, when I got this album in, I think it was very, very late 80s when it was released. It was Miles Davis, a collaboration of Miles Davis with Paul Mickelborg. And he suggested, modern kind of a modernist composer, who gave Miles Davis a certain register of tonality where he will improvise how he feels each of this register of tonality. And it goes like, the colors, white, yellow, all the way down to indigo. Very, it's like a greatly conceptual album. And I remember how I bought it, how I put it. I was a great fan of Miles Davis at the time, particularly his avant-garde, right, the experimental phase. But this is exactly what here we're speaking about. Exactly that is that within the register of that rasa, there is this improvisation. As an artist, as a musician, I'm left with the flavor of that rasa, which has distinctive appearance, let's say distinctive color resonance, flavor-like resonance. And then if I'm here as an artist, then my job and role here is improvising through savoring that, rather than simply being taken over, smitten, destroyed, scattered around. So this is a radically different understanding on emotional states, as, let's say, as opposed to how in many other perspectives this could be seen as something to forego, something to immediately, well, I'm not that, right? It doesn't matter what I'm experiencing, right? I'm this awareness. And so, which has its own value, of course. We're not giving this as, we're not comparing it as if that perspective is inferior. But from the point of view of Tantra, it is inferior. Why? Because there is always an air and the possibility of spiritual bypassing, which is there and then, if we are not fully savoring what no human being is exempt from. If we are unable to experience certain states, that's a totally different story. If we are somehow, because of that impediment, because of certain traumas, certain avoidance strategy that is being created, because it brings emotional resonance on par with tension and painful memory, that's something else altogether. So let us not mix apples and pears. I'd like us to be very clear about that in itself, no emotional state is negative or positive. it is interpreted later on in lieu of how it is seen in cultural context. So yes, it has that value, undoubtedly so. But in terms of what the states, emotional states here represent, they are all of absolute equal value in terms of what the spectrum of the rainbow of colors here is. Nothing other than the breaking of the translucency of pure light of awareness.